Chapter 2: Liberation and Development. The world today is experiencing a profound and rapid sociocultural transformation, but the changes do not occur at a uniform pace, and the discrepancies in the change process have differentiated the various countries and regions of our planet. Contemporary thinkers have become clearly aware of this unequal process of transformation, of its economic causes, and of the basic relationships which combine to determine conditions and approaches. They examine their own circumstances and compare them to those of others. Since they live in a world where communication is fast and efficient, the conditions in which others live are no longer distant and unknown. But thinkers go beyond the limited expectations which such a comparison might create. They see the process of transformation as a quest to satisfy the most fundamental human aspirations: liberty, dignity, the possibility of personal fulfillment for all. Or at least they would like the process to be moving toward these goals. They feel that the satisfaction of these aspirations should be the purpose of all organization and social activity. They know also that all their plans are possible, able to be at least partially implemented. Finally, history demonstrates that the achievements of humanity are cumulative. Their effects and the collective experience of the generations open new perspectives and allow for even greater achievements in the generations yet to come. The phenomenon of the awareness of differences among countries characterizes our era due to the burgeoning of communications media. It is particularly acute in those countries less favored by the evolution of the world economy. The poor countries where the vast majority of humans live. The inhabitants of these countries are aware of the unacceptable living conditions of most of their fellow citizens. They confirm the explanation that these inequalities are caused by a type of relationship which often has been imposed upon them. For these reasons, the efforts for social change in these areas are characterized both by a great urgency and by conflicts stemming from differences of expectations, degrees of pressure, and existing systems of relationships and power. It is well to clarify, on the one hand, that the current and very recent level of expectations of the poor countries goes far beyond a mere imitation of the rich countries, and is of necessity somewhat indistinct and imprecise. On the other hand, both the internal heterogeneity and the presence of external determinants in these societies contributes to defining different needs in different groups. All of this causes a dynamics of action which is inevitably conflictual. The poor countries are not interested in modeling themselves after the rich countries, among other reasons because they are increasingly more convinced that the status of the latter is the fruit of injustice and coercion. It is true that the poor countries are attempting to overcome material insufficiency and misery, but it is in order to achieve a more human society. The concept of development. The term development seems tentatively to have synthesized contemporary aspirations for more human living conditions. The term itself is not new, but its current usage in the social sciences is new, for it responds to a different set of issues which has emerged only recently. Indeed, the old wealth-poverty antinomy no longer expresses all the problems and contemporary aspirations of humankind. Origin. For some, the origin of the term development is, in a sense, negative. They consider it to have appeared in opposition to the term underdevelopment, which expressed the situation and anguish of the poor countries compared with the rich countries. It would perhaps be helpful to recall some of the more important trends which helped clarify the concept of development. First of all, there is the work of Joseph A. Schumpeter, the first economist after the English classics and Marx to concern himself with long-term processes. Schumpeter studied a capitalism characterized by a circular flow, that is, a system which repeats itself from one period to the next and does not suffer appreciable structural change. The element which breaks this equilibrium and introduces a new dynamism is an innovation. Innovations are on the one hand technico-economic, since they are supposed to have originated in these areas, but they are simultaneously politico-social because they imply contradicting and overcoming the prevailing system. Schumpeter calls this process Entwicklung, which today is translated as development, although earlier renderings were evolution or unfolding. The work of the Australian economist Colin Clark represents another important contribution. Clark affirms that the objective of economic activity is not wealth, but well-being, a term understood to mean the satisfaction derived from the resources at one's disposal. He proposes to measure well-being by making comparisons in time and space. The differences among countries are shown by various indicators. His calculations show that the highest levels of well-being are found in the industrialized countries. Clark designated the road toward industrialization which poor countries are to follow as progress, not development. The Bandung Conference of 1955 also played an important role in the evolution of the term, although on a different level. A large number of countries met there, especially Asian and African countries. They recognized their common membership in a third world, underdeveloped and facing two developed worlds, the capitalist and the socialist. This conference marked the beginning of a policy which was supposed to lead out of this state of affairs. Although the deeds that followed did not always correspond to the expectations aroused, Bandung nevertheless signaled a deepened awareness of the fact of underdevelopment and a proclamation of its unacceptability. Approaches. The concept of development has no clear definition. There are a variety of ways to regard it. Rather than reviewing them all at length, we will recall briefly the general areas involved. Development can be regarded as purely economic, and in that sense it would be synonymous with economic growth. The degree of development of a country could be measured, for example, by comparing its gross national product or its per capita income with those of a country regarded as highly developed. It is also possible to refine this gauge and make it more complex, but the presuppositions would still be the same. Development consists above all in increased wealth or, at most, a higher level of well-being. Historically, this is the meaning which appears first. What led to this point of view was perhaps the consideration of the process in England, the first country to develop, and, understandably enough, the first to be studied by economists. This viewpoint was later reinforced by the mirage which the well-being of the rich nations produced. Those who champion this view today, at least explicitly, are few in number. Currently, its value lies in serving as a yardstick to measure more integral notions. However, this focus continues to exist in a more or less subtle form in the capitalistic view of development. The deficiencies of the above-mentioned view have led to another more important and more frequently held one. According to it, development is a total social process, which includes economic, social, political, and cultural aspects. This notion stresses the interdependence of the different factors. Advances in one area imply advances in all of them, and, conversely, the stagnation of one retards the growth of the rest. A consideration of development as a total process leads one to consider also all the external and internal factors which affect the economic evolution of a nation, as well as to evaluate the distribution of goods and services and the system of relationships among the agents of its economic life. This has been carefully worked out by social scientists concerned with so-called third world countries. They have reached the conclusion that the dynamics of world economics lead simultaneously to the creation of greater wealth for the few and greater poverty for the many. From all this flows a strategy of development which, taking into account all the different factors, will allow a country to advance both totally and harmoniously, and to avoid dangerous setbacks. To view development as a total social process necessarily implies for some an ethical dimension, which presupposes a concern for human values. The step toward an elaboration of a humanistic perspective of development is thus taken unconsciously, and it prolongs the former point of view without contradicting it. François Perot worked consistently along these lines. Development for him means the combination of mental and social changes of a people which enable them to increase, cumulatively and permanently, their total real production. Going even further, he says, development is achieved fully in the measure that, by reciprocity of services, it prepares the way for reciprocity of consciousness. It would be a mistake to think that this point of view, which is concerned with human values, is the exclusive preserve of scholars of a Christian inspiration. Converging viewpoints are found in Marxist-inspired positions. This humanistic approach attempts to place the notion of development in a wider context, a historical vision in which humankind assumes control of its own destiny. But this leads precisely to a change of perspective which, after certain additions and corrections, we would prefer to call liberation. We shall attempt to clarify this below. The process of liberation. From the critique of developmentalism to social revolution. The term development has synthesized the aspirations of poor peoples during the last few decades. Recently, however, it has become the object of severe criticism due both to the deficiencies of the development policies proposed to the poor countries to lead them out of their underdevelopment, and also to the lack of concrete achievements of the interested governments. This is the reason why developmentalism, desarrollismo, a term derived from development, desarrollo, is now used in a pejorative sense, especially in Latin America. Much has been said in recent times about development. Poor countries competed for the help of the rich countries. There were even attempts to create a certain development mystique. Support for development was intense in Latin America in the 50s, producing high expectations. But since the supporters of development did not attack the roots of the evil, they failed and caused instead confusion and frustration. One of the most important reasons for this turn of events is that development, approached from an economic and modernizing point of view, has been frequently promoted by international organizations closely linked to groups and governments which control the world economy. The changes encouraged were to be achieved within the formal structure of the existing institutions without challenging them. Great care was exercised, therefore, not to attack the interests of large international economic powers, nor those of their natural allies, the ruling domestic interest groups. Furthermore, the so-called changes were often nothing more than new and underhanded ways of increasing the power of strong economic groups. Developmentalism thus came to be synonymous with reformism and modernization, that is to say, synonymous with timid measures, really ineffective in the long run and counterproductive to achieving a real transformation. The poor countries are becoming ever more clearly aware that their underdevelopment is only the byproduct of the development of other countries, because of the kind of relationship which exists between the rich and the poor countries. Moreover, they are realizing that their own development will come about only with a struggle to break the domination of the rich countries. This perception sees the conflict implicit in the process. Development must attack the root causes of the problems, and among them the deepest is economic, social, political, and cultural dependence of some countries upon others, an expression of the domination of some social classes over others. Attempts to bring about changes within the existing order have proven futile. This analysis of the situation is at the level of scientific rationality. Only a radical break from the status quo, that is, a profound transformation of the private property system, access to power of the exploited class, and a social revolution that would break this dependence would allow for the change to a new society, a socialist society, or at least allow that such a society might be possible. In this light, to speak about the process of liberation begins to appear more appropriate and richer in human content. Liberation, in fact, expresses the inescapable moment of radical change which is foreign to the ordinary use of the term development. Only in the context of such a process can a policy of development be effectively implemented, have any real meaning, and avoid misleading formulations. Humankind, the agent of its own destiny. To characterize the situation of the poor countries as dominated and oppressed leads one to speak of economic, social, and political liberation. But we are dealing here with a much more integral and profound understanding of human existence and its historical future. A broad and deep aspiration for liberation inflames the history of humankind in our day. Liberation from all that limits or keeps human beings from self-fulfillment. Liberation from all impediments to the exercise of freedom. Proof of this is the awareness of new and subtle forms of oppression in the heart of advanced industrial societies, which often offer themselves as models to the underdeveloped countries. In them, subversion does not appear as a protest against poverty, but rather against wealth. The context in the rich countries, however, is quite different from that of the poor countries. We must beware of all kinds of imitations as well as new forms of imperialism, revolutionary this time, of the rich countries, which consider themselves central to the history of humankind. Such mimicry would only lead the revolutionary groups of the Third World to a new deception regarding their own reality. They would be led to a fight against windmills. But, having acknowledged this danger, it is important to remember also that the poor countries would err in not following these events closely, since their future depends at least partially upon what happens on the domestic scene in the dominant countries. Their own efforts at liberation cannot be indifferent to that proclaimed by growing minorities in rich nations. There are, moreover, valuable lessons to be learned by the revolutionaries of the countries on the periphery, who could in turn use them as corrective measures in the difficult task of building a new society. What is at stake in the South as well as in the North, in the West as well as the East, on the periphery and in the center, is the possibility of enjoying a truly human existence, a free life, dynamic liberty which is related to history as a conquest. We have today an ever clearer vision of this dynamism and this conquest, but their roots stretch into the past. The 15th and 16th centuries are important milestones in human self-understanding. Human relationship with nature changed substantially with the emergence of experimental science and the techniques of manipulation derived from it. Relying on these achievements, humankind abandoned its former image of the world and itself. Gilson expresses this idea in a well-known phrase. It is because of its physics that metaphysics grows old. Because of science, humankind took a step forward and began to regard itself in a different way. This process indicates why the best philosophical tradition is not merely an armchair product. It is rather the reflective and thematic awareness of human experience, of human relationships with nature and with other persons. And these relationships are interpreted and at the same time modified by advances in technological and scientific knowledge. Descartes is one of the great names of the new physics which altered human relationship to nature. He laid the cornerstone of a philosophical reflection which stressed the primacy of thought and of clear and distinct ideas, and so highlighted the creative aspects of human subjectivity. Kant's Copernican revolution strengthened and systematized this point of view. For him, our concept ought not to conform to the objects, but rather the objects must conform to my conceptions. The reason is that we only cognize in things a priori that which we ourselves place in them. Kant was aware that this leads to a new method of thought, to a knowledge which is critical of its foundations and thus abandons its naivete and enters an adult stage. Hegel followed this approach, introducing with vitality and urgency the theme of history. To a great extent, his philosophy is a reflection on the French Revolution. This historical event had vast repercussions, for it proclaimed the right of all to participate in the direction of the society to which they belong. For Hegel, one is aware of oneself only by being acknowledged or recognized by another consciousness. But this being recognized by another presupposes an initial conflict, a life and death struggle, because solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. Through the Lord Bondsman dialectic, resulting from this original confrontation,
The historical process will then appear as the genesis of consciousness, and therefore of the gradual liberation of humankind. Through the dialectical process, humankind constructs itself and attains a real awareness of its own being. It liberates itself in the acquisition of genuine freedom, which through work transforms the world and educates the human species. For Hegel, world history is the progression of the awareness of freedom. Moreover, the driving force of history is the difficult conquest of freedom, hardly perceptible in its initial stages. It is the passage from awareness of freedom to real freedom. It is freedom in itself that comprises within itself the infinite necessity of bringing itself to consciousness and thereby, since knowledge about itself is its very nature, to reality. Thus human nature gradually takes hold of its own destiny. It looks ahead and turns toward a society in which it will be free of all alienation and servitude. This focus will initiate a new dimension in philosophy, social criticism. Marx deepened and renewed this line of thought in his unique way, but this required what has been called an epistemological break, a notion taken from Gaston Bachelard, with previous thought. The new attitude was expressed clearly in the famous Theses on Feuerbach, in which Marx presented concisely but penetratingly the essential elements of his approach. In them, especially in the first thesis, Marx situated himself equidistant between the old materialism and idealism. More precisely, he presented his position as the dialectical transcendence of both. Of the first, he retained the affirmation of the objectivity of the external world. Of the second, he kept the transforming capacity of human nature. For Marx, to know was something indissolubly linked to the transformation of the world through work. Basing his thought on these first intuitions, he went on to construct a scientific understanding of historical reality. He analyzed capitalistic society, in which were found concrete instances of the exploitation of persons by their fellows and of one social class by another. Pointing the way towards an era in history when humankind can live humanly, Marx created categories which allowed for the elaboration of a science of history. The door was opened for science to help humankind take one more step on the road of critical thinking. It made humankind more aware of the socioeconomic determinants of its ideological creations, and therefore freer and more lucid in relation to them. But at the same time, these new insights enabled humankind to have greater control and rational grasp of its historical initiatives. This interpretation is valid unless, of course, one holds a dogmatic and mechanistic interpretation of history. These initiatives ought to assure the change from the capitalistic mode of production to the socialistic mode, that is to say, to one oriented toward a society in which persons can begin to live freely and humanly. They will have controlled nature, created the conditions for a socialized production of wealth, done away with private acquisition of excessive wealth, and established socialism. But modern human aspirations include not only liberation from exterior pressures which prevent fulfillment as a member of a certain social class, country, or society. Persons seek likewise an interior liberation, in an individual and intimate dimension. They seek liberation not only on a social plane, but also on a psychological. They seek an interior freedom understood, however, not as an ideological evasion from social confrontation or as the internalization of a situation of dependency. Rather, it must be in relation to the real world of the human psyche as understood since Freud. A new frontier was in effect opened up when Freud highlighted the unconscious determinants of human behavior, with repression as the central element of the human psychic makeup. Repression is the result of the conflict between instinctive drives and the cultural and ethical demands of the social environment. For Freud, unconscious motivations exercise a tyrannical power and can produce aberrant behavior. This behavior is controllable only if the subject becomes aware of these motivations through an accurate reading of the new language of meanings created by the unconscious. Since Hegel, we have seen conflict used as a germinal explanatory category and awareness as a step in the conquest of freedom. In Freud, however, they appear in a psychological process which ought also to lead to a fuller liberation of humankind. The scope of liberation on the collective and historical level does not always and satisfactorily include psychological liberation. Psychological liberation includes dimensions which do not exist in or are not sufficiently integrated with collective historical liberation. We are not speaking here, however, of facilely separating them or putting them in opposition to one another. It seems to me, writes David Cooper, that a cardinal failure of all past revolutions has been the dissociation of liberation on the mass social level, i.e. liberation of whole classes in economic and political terms, and liberation on the level of the individual and the concrete groups in which he is directly engaged. If we are to talk of revolution today, our talk will be meaningless unless we effect some union between the macro-social and micro-social, and between inner reality and outer reality. Moreover, alienation and exploitation, as well as the very struggle for liberation from them, have ramifications on the personal and psychological planes which it would be dangerous to overlook in the process of constructing a new society and a new person. These personal aspects, considered not as excessively privatized, but rather as encompassing all human dimensions, are also under consideration in the contemporary debate concerning greater participation in all political activity. This is so even in a socialist society. In this area, Marcuse's attempt, under the influence of Hegel and Marx, to use the psychoanalytical categories for social criticism is important. Basing his observations on a work which Freud himself did not hold in high regard, Civilization and its Discontents, Marcuse analyzes the over-repressive character of the affluent society and envisions the possibility of a non-repressive society, a possibility skeptically denied by Freud. Marcuse's analyses of advanced industrial society, capitalistic or socialistic, led him to denounce the emergence of a one-dimensional and oppressive society. In order to achieve this non-repressive society, however, it will be necessary to challenge the values espoused by the society which denies human beings the possibility of living freely. Marcuse labels this great refusal the specter of a revolution which subordinates the development of the productive forces and higher standards of living to the requirements of creating solidarity for the human species, for abolishing poverty and misery beyond all national frontiers and spheres of interest, for the attainment of peace. We are not suggesting, of course, that we should endorse without question every aspect of this development of ideas. There are ambiguities, critical observations to be made, and points to be clarified. Many ideas must be reconsidered in the light of a history that advances inexorably, simultaneously confirming and rejecting previous assertions. Ideas must be reconsidered, too, in light of praxis, which is the proving ground of all theory, and in light of socio-cultural realities very different from those from which the ideas emerged. But all this should not lead us to an attitude of distrustful reserve toward these ideas. Rather, it should suggest that the task to be undertaken is formidable, and the task is all the more urgent because these reflections are attempts to express a deeply rooted sentiment in today's masses, the aspiration to liberation. This aspiration is still confusedly perceived, but there is an ever greater awareness of it. Furthermore, for many persons in various ways, this aspiration, in Vietnam or Brazil, New York or Prague, has become a norm for their behavior and a sufficient reason to lead lives of dedication. Their commitment is the backbone which validates and gives historical viability to the development of the ideas outlined above. To conceive of history as a process of human liberation is to consider freedom as a historical conquest. It is to understand that the step from an abstract to a real freedom is not taken without a struggle against all the forces that oppress humankind, a struggle full of pitfalls, detours, and temptations to run away. The goal is not only better living conditions, a radical change of structures, a social revolution. It is much more. The continuous creation, never ending, of a new way to be human, a permanent cultural revolution. In other words, what is at stake above all is a dynamic and historical conception of the human person, oriented definitively and creatively toward the future, acting in the present for the sake of tomorrow. Teilhard de Chardin has remarked that humankind has taken hold of the reins of evolution. History, contrary to essentialist and static thinking, is not the development of potentialities pre-existent in human nature. It is rather the conquest of new, qualitatively different ways of being a human person in order to achieve an ever more total and complete fulfillment of the individual in solidarity with all humankind. The concept of liberation theologically considered. Although we will consider liberation from a theological perspective more extensively later, it is important at this time to attempt an initial treatment in the light of what we have just discussed. The term development is relatively new in the texts of the ecclesiastical magisterium. Except for a brief reference by Pius XII, the subject is broached for the first time by John XXIII in the encyclical letter Mater et Magistra. Pacem in Terris gives the term special attention. Gaudium et Spes dedicates a whole section to it, though the treatment is not original. All these documents stress the urgency of eliminating the existing injustices and the need for an economic development geared to the service of humankind. Finally, Populorum Progressio discusses development as its central theme. Here the language and ideas are clearer. The adjective integral is added to development, putting things in a different context and opening new perspectives. These new viewpoints were already hinted at in the sketchy discussion of Vatican Council II on dependence and liberation. Gaudium et Spes points out that nations on the road to progress continually fall behind, while very often their dependence on wealthier nations deepens more rapidly, even in the economic sphere. Number 9. Later, it acknowledges that, although nearly all peoples have gained their independence, it is still far from true that they are free from excessive inequalities and from every form of undue dependence. Number 85. These assertions should lead to a discernment of the need to be free from dependence, to be liberated from it. The same Gaudium et Spes on 2 occasions touches on liberation and laments the fact that it is seen exclusively as the fruit of human effort. Many look forward to a genuine and total emancipation of humanity wrought solely by human effort. They are convinced that the future rule of man over the earth will satisfy every desire of his heart. Number 10. Or it is concerned that liberation be reduced to a purely economic and social level. Among the forms of modern atheism is that which anticipates the liberation of man, especially through his economic and social emancipation. Number 20. These assertions presuppose, negatively speaking, that liberation must be placed in a wider context. They criticize a narrow vision. They allow, therefore, for the possibility of a genuine and total liberation. Unfortunately, this wider perspective is not elaborated. We find some indications, however, in the texts in which Gaudium et Spes speaks of the birth of a new humanism, one in which man is defined first of all by his responsibility toward his brothers and toward history. Number 55. There is a need for persons who are makers of history, who are truly new and artisans of a new humanity. Number 30. Persons moved by the desire to build a really new society. Indeed, the conciliar document asserts that beneath economic and political demands lies a deeper and more widespread longing. Persons and societies thirst for a full and free life worthy of man, one in which they can subject to their own welfare all that the modern world can offer them so abundantly. Number 9. All this is but a beginning. It is an oft-noted fact that Gaudium et Spes in general offers a rather ironic description of the human situation. It touches up the uneven spots, smooths the rough edges, avoids the more conflictual aspects, and stays away from the sharper confrontations among social classes and countries. The encyclical Populorum Progressio goes a step further. In a somewhat isolated text, it speaks clearly of building a world where every man, no matter what his race, religion, or nationality, can live a fully human life, freed from servitude imposed on him by other men or by natural forces over which he has not sufficient control. Number 47. It is unfortunate, however, that this idea was not expanded in this encyclical. From this point of view, Populorum Progressio is a transitional document. Although it energetically denounces the international imperialism of money, situations whose injustice cries to heaven, and the growing gap between rich and poor countries, ultimately it addresses itself to the great ones of this world, urging them to carry out the necessary changes. The outright use of the language of liberation, instead of its mere suggestion, would have given a more decided and direct thrust in favor of the oppressed, encouraging them to break with their present situation and take control of their own destiny. The theme of liberation appears more completely discussed in the Message from 18 Bishops of the Third World, published as a specific response to the call made by Populorum Progressio. It is also treated frequently, almost to the point of being a synthesis of its message, in the conclusions of the Second General Conference of Latin American Bishops held in Medellin, Colombia in 1968. Which have more doctrinal authority than the 18 bishops' message. In both these documents, the focus has changed. The situation is not judged from the point of view of the countries at the center, but rather of those on the periphery, providing insiders experience of their anguish and aspirations. The product of a profound historical movement, this aspiration to liberation is beginning to be accepted by the Christian community as a sign of the times, as a call to commitment and interpretation. The biblical message, which presents the work of Christ as a liberation, provides the framework for this interpretation. Theology seems to have avoided for a long time reflecting on the conflictual character of human history, the confrontations among individuals, social classes, and countries. St. Paul continuously reminds us, however, of the pastoral core of Christian existence and of all human life. The passage from the old to the new person, from sin to grace, from slavery to freedom. For freedom, Christ has set us free, Galatians 5:1, St. Paul tells us. He refers here to liberation from sin insofar as it represents a selfish turning in upon oneself. To sin is to refuse to love one's neighbors and, therefore, the Lord himself. Sin, a breach of friendship with God and others, is according to the Bible the ultimate cause of poverty, injustice, and the oppression in which persons live. In describing sin as the ultimate cause, we do not in any way negate the structural reasons and the objective determinants leading to those situations. It does, however, emphasize the fact that things do not happen by chance, and that behind an unjust structure there is a personal or collective will responsible, a willingness to reject God and neighbor. It suggests likewise that a social transformation, no matter how radical it may be, does not automatically achieve the suppression of all evils. But St. Paul asserts not only that Christ liberated us, he also tells us that he did it in order that we might be free. Free for what? Free to love. In the language of the Bible, writes Bonhoeffer, freedom is not something man has for himself, but something he has for others. It is not a possession, a presence, an object, but a relationship and nothing else. In truth, freedom is a relationship between two persons. Being free means being free for the other, because the other has bound me to him. Only in relationship with the other am I free. The freedom to which we are called presupposes the going out of oneself, the breaking down of our selfishness, and of all the structures that support our selfishness. The foundation of this freedom is openness to others. The fullness of liberation, a free gift from Christ, is communion with God and with other human beings. Conclusion. Summarizing what has been said above, we can distinguish three reciprocally interpenetrating levels of meaning of the term liberation, or in other words, three approaches to the process of liberation. In the first place, liberation expresses the aspirations of oppressed peoples and social classes, emphasizing the conflictual aspect of the economic, social, and political process, which puts them at odds with wealthy nations and oppressive classes. In contrast, the word development, and above all the policies characterized as developmentalist, desarrollista, appear somewhat aseptic, giving a false picture of a tragic and conflictual reality. The issue of development does in fact find its true place in the more universal, profound, and radical perspective of liberation. It is only within this framework that development finds its true meaning and possibilities of accomplishing something worthwhile. At a deeper level, liberation can be applied to an understanding of history. Humankind is seen as assuming conscious responsibility for its own destiny. This understanding provides a dynamic context and broadens the horizons of the desired social changes. In this perspective, the unfolding of all the dimensions of humanness is demanded, persons who make themselves throughout their life and throughout history. The gradual conquest of true freedom leads to the creation of a new humankind and a qualitatively different society. This vision provides, therefore, a better understanding of what in fact is at stake in our times. Finally, the word development to a certain extent limits and obscures the theological problems implied in the process designated by this term. On the contrary, the word liberation allows for another approach leading to the biblical sources which inspire the presence and action of humankind in history. In the Bible, Christ is presented as the one who brings us liberation. Christ the Savior liberates from sin, which is the ultimate root of all disruption of friendship and of all injustice and oppression. Christ makes humankind truly free, that is to say, he enables us to live in communion with him, and this is the basis for all human fellowship. This is not a matter of three parallel or chronologically successive processes, however. There are three levels of meaning of a single, complex process which finds its deepest sense and its full realization in the saving work of Christ. These levels of meaning, therefore, are interdependent. A comprehensive view of the matter presupposes that all three aspects can be considered together. In this way, two pitfalls will be avoided. First, idealist or spiritualist approaches, which are nothing but ways of evading a harsh and demanding reality, and second, shallow analyses and programs of short-term effect initiated under the pretext of meeting immediate needs.